All right, so God has been doing a great work through Elisha the prophet. We've already gone through the life of Elijah. We're looking through the life of his protege, Elisha. So Elisha healed the waters at Jericho. He provided for a widow through multiplying oil. He raised a young man from the dead through prayer, of course. He healed poisonous food, multiplied food to feed 100 men. And today, we see Elisha's ministry extending to someone outside of Israel. Today we see Elisha's ministry extending to someone in the north, in Syria. And you might remember, if we're dealing with the northern kingdom of Israel, again, this general area, including the land of Gilead and a little south of that, down towards between Ammon and Moab. So you have the land of Israel. To the north and east, you have kind of a fairly serious local threat. And on our map it says Aram, but Aram is Syria, just like Shinar is... Aram is to Syria as Shinar is to Babylon, right? Or as Mizraim is to, that's a little harder. That's Bible trivia for 900. Mizraim is to, what's that? Oh, I thought you said it right. No, it's close. I mean, that's not really close. But I mean, it's a good guess. What's that? Mizraim. Anyone read the King James and read about, in the Hebrew it says Mitzrayim. And that gets translated as this nearby nation to Israel. That's a big hint. Because there's not that many nearby nations. This major nearby, Egypt. It's Egypt. It's Egypt. The region of Egypt. Yeah. Anyway, so Aram and Syria, right? Aram is Syria. So up here in Syria, you have a pretty serious threat up there, but you have a guy who's leading in Syria. His name is Ben-Hadad. And this guy, he basically helped, he fought against Israel. And you might remember King Ahab going to battle against Syria to try to recover the town of Ramoth Gilead, which on our map is in the border of Israel, but Syria is controlling it. You might remember King Ahab, an evil king, one of the worst of the worst. You might remember Ahab dying in that battle at the hands of the Syrian army. Well, here we have a guy up there in Syria who is a general of the military. He's like one of the commanders of the army, and he's ill. He's sick. He needs help. What would generally be considered an enemy of Israel, he needs help. Look at verse 1. 2 Kings 5, verse 1. Now, let me just back that. Oh, yeah. Now Naaman, captain of the army of the king of Aram, or the king of Syria, was a great man with his master. What's that mean? That he's a great man with his master? Yeah, it doesn't mean he's great alongside with his master. They're both great. It means he is great in the eyes of his master. He has a great position with his master, and his master is the king. So Naaman was a great man with his master and highly respected, because by Naaman, the Lord had given victory to Aram. The man was also a valiant warrior, but he was a leper. So this guy is a military general in the army of the biggest enemy that Israel has right now. Ahab, the king, the former king, died as little as 2 years ago. So from the time that Ahab died until this passage, it's as little as 2 years. It's as many as maybe 12. But we're going to say just a few years. And Naaman has achieved, look at this. The Lord had given Naaman victory. he had given Syria victory through Naaman, through this general. And some people think this victory that's talking about here is the battle that killed Ahab. That's what Josephus says. Josephus thinks that's the reference to killing Ahab. Well, anyway, he's a valiant warrior, but he's a leper. And those two things don't often go together, right? You know, you can't be this strong, valiant warrior and then be so weak that you can't carry out your duties. So he's a valiant warrior that's kind of turned, now his life has been changed. It kind of reminds me of, I just saw this. I went on Amazon Prime to see if there was anything interesting, and the first thing that popped up was this show on, what's her name? Celine Dion. Now, I don't listen to this type of music. I'm not into worldly music at all. I can't do it. But Celine Dion was like a big singer in our day. I tried to tell my kids she was like almost something close to like what Taylor Swift would be to the generation today. And the world loved. So she's so sick and she's so ill. She's almost like what do they call it? Stiff person syndrome. So here she was mighty in the eyes of the world, and she's kind of been brought to this. I watched a few minutes of it. It was really difficult to watch. It's really difficult physical place that she's been brought to. And we saw that with other people. Like, for instance, you could look back in the 80s and see someone like Michael J. Fox, right? And you grew up in the 80s, you were like, yeah, Michael J. Fox is cool, man. He went back to the future. And then, look what happened to Michael J. Fox. And we could look back at other people like Reeves, Christopher Reeves, Superman from the 80s. He's Superman, and all this power and all this, in the movies, of course. And then you saw how kind of he ended his life in a wheelchair and crippled and paralyzed and stuff like that. And so we see these instances, these people who are great people who or at least in the eyes of the world, at least in those instances, they were great people, and they kind of had been brought down by illness or circumstance. Well, Naaman is something like that. And leprosy is a pretty serious skin disease. Today's leprosy can be extremely painful. Today's leprosy is Hansen's disease. We don't know that that's what was going on here. With Hansen's disease, it can eat away your body. You can lose fingers, toes, hands, limbs. You can die. Listen to what Moses says about life as a leper. In Leviticus 13, 45 and 46, as for the leper who has the infection, his clothes shall be torn, the hair of his head shall be uncovered, and he shall cover his mustache and cry, unclean, right? Unclean. He shall remain unclean all the days during which he has the infection. He is unclean. He shall live alone. His dwelling shall be outside the camp. Lepers, when they went into town, they needed to let everyone know they were there. Kind of reminds me of time during the pandemic a little bit. If you got the virus and you had to be out somewhere, I just remember, I've been exposed. Stay away from me. I've been exposed. I'd come into church and be like, look, I've been around someone that has the virus, so just kind of keep your distance from me. I don't want you to get sick and die. That type of thing. Like, it wasn't quite the same. If you were exposed, then our policy was, stay home until, but there were situations where you were exposed. Well, here's a guy who, when he has to go out into public, he has to cry out to everyone to let him know that he's unclean. And they know, stay away from this guy. It's like, it's ostracism. It's social ostracism. It's being cut off from society to a certain extent. That way other people were protected from them. In the ancient world, to be a leper would have been considered to be cursed by the gods. And it really, really is a terrible, terrible situation of pain and social isolation. Kids, what that means is you're separated from everyone, and you're basically kept separated. And there are leper colonies where lepers would live together in order to try to survive. Now, again, we don't know we don't necessarily know the extent or the full nature of this form of leprosy that Naaman has, but what I'm describing to you is really the most serious form of it. Well, ever since Naaman has become a leper. Apparently, it seems that his life has been one of suffering. And I imagine in a situation like that, you think, look, other people get sick. Other people get cancer. Not me. That happens to other people. Other people have heart disease. Other people get rare illnesses. Not me. Other people get MS. Other people get Lou Gehrig's disease. But if it happened to you, that's different. Am I right? You know about other people having it, and they're out there somewhere, and maybe you even know some. But if it happens to you, it's different. That's how I know all of us are narcissists. That's how I know. That's how I know I'm a narcissist, because if someone else has it, man, that stinks. But if I have it, I have it. It's different when I have it. Who else feels that way? Anyone not feel that way? If you've raised your hand there, you're probably not telling the truth, right? Well, this, like, the worst thing that could happen to Naaman happens to him. The worst thing that could happen. It would be like getting a diagnosis of cancer today, or like getting a diagnosis of having Lou Gehrig's disease, or something like that. I imagine hope becomes a problem. I imagine you start like getting down on yourself a little bit and thinking like, maybe getting depressed or whatever else. But then Naaman receives just a glimmer of hope from a most unlikely source. Look at verses 2 and 3. Now the Arameans had gone out in bands. By the way, that's not rock bands, just so you guys know. That's not like AC/DC and Metallica and other people like that, these heavy metal bands or any of those things. These are groups of men, okay? So I wouldn't think I'd have to explain that to people, but you would be surprised. So you'd be surprised. Anyway, the Arameans had gone out in bands, groups of men, groups of people, and had taken captive a little girl from the land of Israel, and she waited on or served Naaman's wife. She said to her mistress, "I wish that my master were with the prophet who is in Samaria. Then he would cure him of his leprosy." And so we read about this little girl. Now, what had been happening is that the Syrians, and we know this, and we saw some of this, is that the Syrians had been encroaching into the land of Israel and taking property and stuff like that, like raiding their goods. Well, during one of their raids, they take this little girl. They take her as a slave, as a servant. Now try to imagine what life would have been like for her. Try to imagine the likelihood is, we don't know this for sure, the likelihood is that her parents had been killed. That's the likelihood, is that her parents had been killed and that she had been taken captive by these invaders, ripped out of her home and taken to a foreign land. And now she's a servant girl of the wife of Naaman, the military general. So she's serving in the house of Naaman, or at least in the household of Naaman at some level. I imagine that she could have been extremely resentful. I imagine that that your captors, that you could really be like, have really hard feelings against them. In that scenario, she could have seen her master suffering and said, "Good for him. He deserves it. He deserves to be a leper for their role in invading my homeland and taking me as a slave." I mean, I imagine that it's a realistic possibility that a person could feel that way. I think there's something about me, there's something deep inside of me that would see someone who does something terribly wrong and to me, and if something were to happen, to say, "Man, that's a hand of God." That's the hand of God. I imagine that there would be something like that that could be deep inside of her, but we don't see that. We don't see it. She knows that these people need the Lord. And that's bigger than her personal circumstances. And so she tells them about this great prophet in Israel. Here he is, here she is outside of her homeland, without status in the world, pretty much as low as you can get, from a social perspective at least. And yet God is able to use her to direct these people to the Lord. And you should think about that. You should think about, you might be thinking, you know what, I'm not that important. Who am I? You may not feel like you have a whole lot of influence. Well, let me tell you, God can use you if you let him. Here's a little servant girl that God was able to use because she let God use her. She directed these people toward the Lord. Now that's just the first part of this, right? When Naaman hears about this prophet, there's hope. And he tells the king in verse 4, Naaman went in and told his master, saying, thus and thus spoke the girl who is from the land of Israel. Maybe, just maybe, he can be healed by this prophet in Israel. And the king of Syria, anyone remember his name? I already gave it to you. Bible trivia for 100. The king of Syria's name is? What's that? I think I heard it. Oh, you're thinking of Aram. Tom? Yes! Ben-Hadad, yes. Aram is the place, the other name for Syria. Ben-Hadad, which means son of Hadad, son of the storm god of Syria, son of the fertility god of Syria. Ben-Hadad is the king. Well, anyway, Ben-Hadad, he's all for this. He's all for having his military general. I mean, listen, Naaman is a valuable asset to the king. And he wants him to be healed. And so he sends a letter to the king of Israel, who is the son of the king that he killed. So he killed Ahab, and now Ahab's son, he's sending a message to Ahab's son. Now, that would be an interesting conversation, right? Like, hey, listen, I know I killed your pops, but we could let bygones be bygones here, right? It's no big deal. Let me get a mulligan. Like, I don't know. Maybe it's nothing like that at all. Maybe it's more like, hey, I'm going to send this letter, and I'm expecting, I'm the head honcho here. All right, I'm the guy in charge here. I'm the guy who proves that I have the real power in this area right now. Maybe it's something like that. But anyway, verse 5. Then the king of Aram said, go now, and I will send a letter to the king of Israel. He departed and took with him 10 talents of silver and 6,000 shekels of gold and 10 changes of clothes. He brought the letter, which is a big deal. I'll tell you about that in a second. He brought the letter to the king of Israel, saying, and now as this letter comes to you, behold, I have sent Naaman my servant to you, that you may cure him of his leprosy. So the king of Syria sends Naaman with an extravagant payload of money. Check this out. He has 10 talents of silver, which in today's marketplace is said to be right around $150,000 dollarinis. Okay? $150,000. That sounds like a lot of money, right? To be carrying to Israel to pay off, because he thinks, what he thinks is, he thinks that Elisha is on the king's payroll, because that's what you do. You have prophets and you have wise men and discerners and stuff like that who are on the king's payroll. Can you think of any king in the Old Testament who had wise men on his payroll? Any Old Testament king, foreign king, who had wise men that we read about? Nebuchadnezzar, yeah, that's pretty good. Nebuchadnezzar, right? So we can also say, I think Pharaoh as well. So nevertheless, so we have $150,000, and then we have 6,000. So if this is 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, which is in today's marketplace, the equivalent is said to be something like $3 million. $3 million. So if these numbers are right, and it seems that they are, based on charts of weights and measurement and stuff like that. Remember, you're coming from royalty. It's not like I'm sending someone I know. It's like the king, the leader of all the land, who's taxing all the people, who's taxing the people that he's conquering and different things. He's sending like $3.15 million. I guess what we could say, a disgusting amount of money. Is that fair? If I had $3 million, I think I could live, I don't know for sure, I think I could live off the interest. What's 3? Let's say 4%. Let's just say money more, 4%. What's 4% of 3 million? That's $120,000 a year. I think I could do that. I think if I tried really hard, that's a joke. If I tried really hard, I could live on $120,000 a year, right? You know, you can live off the interest of this money. And so it's a disgusting amount of money. No expense will be spared to bring healing to this great man. He's willing to spend big money. The king is willing to spend big money, just like the Knicks just spent big money on OG Anunoby. No Knicks fans here? Hoping the Yankees do the same thing with Juan Soto. But anyway, so a lot of money out here. And Naaman is willing to travel far and wide. We're talking about 130 miles from Damascus, which would take about a week. And just to try and imagine traveling, you know, I had a guy, I had some work done at my house, and the bill was $3,000 for some of these repairs. And the guy said, okay, I'd like cash. And I'm like, I'm not taking $3,000 cash out of my bank and walking outside of my bank with $3,000 and then traveling from my bank, which is like 20 minutes away, with $3,000 of cash. Like, I'm not gonna pay $3,000. I'll find, we'll figure. You want to come to the bank with me? We'll go to the bank first thing in the morning. We'll both go in together. I'll get the $3,000 and hand it to you. I'm not walking out of that bank with $3,000 cash. These guys are traveling for a week with what's like over $3 million. Anyone else feel comfortable traveling with $3,000 in your pocket? All right, I know who to follow after church. I don't feel comfortable. I just don't. I don't even carry a wallet. I don't carry cash on me at all. You know, if I do carry anything, I carry a couple of credit cards, which I pay off at the end of the month. I don't believe in credit card debt. But these guys are it's dangerous to travel a week with $3 million on land. There's raiders, there's people who would rob you and stuff like that. But for Naaman and for his king, it's worth it. And Naaman will do just about anything in order to be healed. Now, let's shift scenes. We've kind of had two scenes here. The first scene, where would you say that first scene was? What's that? Like in Naaman's house, right, in Aram. We have kind of like a second mini scene there, which we would say would be around where? If we had to narrow down a place of where that little conversation with the king of Syria would have been. Where, if we were going to put a location on that type of a scene, where would we put a location? Maybe like the palace in Syria, maybe like in Damascus or something like that, right? So we have a first scene in Syria with a couple of like little mini scenes. And now we kind of like move away from that and we move into the palace in Samaria. Samaria is the capital city of the northern kingdom of Israel, right in the smack dab middle of Israel. And we enter into the king's palace. Check this out. In verse 7. When the king of Israel read the letter, so what happens is he'll get a letter, and that letter would most likely be, there would be a piece of hot clay placed on the letter, and his ring would go on to know that a seal would go on, and he would break that seal, and he would open up the scroll, and he would read this scroll about healing Naaman. And he tore his clothes and said, "Am I God? Am I God to kill and to make alive, that this man is sending word to me to cure a man of his leprosy? But consider now, and see how he is seeking a quarrel against me. You know what's going on right here? Ben-Hadad, the king of Syria, he is fixing to fight. That's what's going on. He came in and, hey, listen, he told my father that he was going to give the cities back to Israel that he had taken in the second to last battle they had, including Jabesh-Gilead, and he never did that. He basically picked a fight with my dad and killed my dad. It's like, don't mess with my daddy. He was kind of like George W. Bush going after Saddam Hussein, because Saddam messed with Pops. He messed with George H.W. But anyway, don't mess with he killed my daddy. And, this guy's picking a fight. And listen, if you're the king of Israel, it would make sense. It would make sense, like, what's this guy think? I'm going to just go in here and heal this? He's thinking I'm going to heal this guy? We can do the impossible? He's picking a fight. But then Elisha, the scene shifts again to Elisha's house. So you ever watch a movie or something where it's like one episode happens here and then all of a sudden like the scene shifts to some other character and then it kind of goes back to it. It's a real effective storytelling technique where you're kind of going back and forth between these characters and eventually something happens where they all end up together in the end fighting or marrying or whatever, I don't know. Well, here you have just another scene in the prophet's house in verse 8 when Elisha, the man of God, hears of it. It happened when Elisha, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his clothes, that he sent word to the king saying, "Why have you torn your clothes? Let him come to me. He shall know that there is a prophet in Israel." And again, we don't know for sure where he is at this point. I'm thinking the last we saw him, he was in Gilgal, the nearby town of Gilgal. Whatever the case is, he sends word to the king and he says, look, you should know, in other words, you should know the power of God. You should see how powerful, didn't you see what happened the last time you went to battle with the kings? I mean, you should understand how powerful our God is, that he could do this. And that there is indeed a prophet in Israel. This is an evangelistic thing for Elisha. This is a chance for the king of Israel to see who God really is, because what family does the king of Israel come from? What line, what dynasty? We'll accept a couple answers here. What dynasty is the king of Israel from? In other words, who's his daddy? Brittany? He comes from the line of Ahab, from the dynasty of Omri. And what gods do the family, what gods does the dynasty of Omri worship? Did I say that right? What gods the dynasty of Ahab does worship? They do worship. That doesn't sound right. Okay. So what gods do they worship? Who said, what was that? Baal. You didn't raise your hand, though. We had a hand over here, so, help us out here a little bit. Baal and Asherah and all these fertility gods. So for Elisha, this is a chance for the king of Israel it's an evangelistic thing, for him to see God's power. Once again, he should have known that already. But not only him, it's a chance for Naaman to see this God. It's an evangelistic thing for Naaman and extends even beyond Naaman to the king of Syria. This is an evangelistic thing for everybody around, that there is a God in Israel. And that Naaman should come to know the Lord, and that the son of Ahab should come to know the Lord, and that Ben-Hadad, the king of Syria, should come to know the Lord. And so Naaman travels to this prophet of the Lord. I don't know exactly how it happens, but I imagine the king of Israel's like, hey, okay, go. He says he's going to go see him. I don't know what happens. It doesn't really say in Scripture exactly how that plays out. But Naaman travels towards this prophet of the Lord. And I imagine as he gets closer, the anticipation builds. I imagine his hope grows with each step of the animal's foot. What do you call the foot? The hoof. The hoof. With each step of the animal's hoof. And then I imagine he sees the prophet's place off in the distance. And he arrives at the house with pomp and circumstance and $3 million, right? Something like that. And 10, not to mention the 10 changes of clothes. What will the prophet do? Will the prophet bring healing? What miraculous display of greatness will he perform? Come back next week. No, I'm just teasing. Could you imagine? I said, come back 4 weeks from now and we'll get the rest of that story. No. He arrives at Elisha's house in verses 9 and 10. So Naaman came with his horses and his chariots and stood at the doorway of the house of Elisha. Elisha sent a messenger. He didn't even go out. Elisha didn't even go out to him. Elisha sent a messenger to him. Who do we think that messenger is? We don't know for sure, but we have a pretty good guess. Based on the rest of the account, we have a pretty good guess. For those of you who know the story, who do we think this messenger is? What's that? The servant Gehazi. That's what we think. Elisha sent a messenger to him saying, and by the way, in a couple of weeks, we're going to see about Gehazi. We're going to see a little bit about what Gehazi really is. So Elisha sent a messenger to him saying, go and wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh will be restored to you, and you will be clean. Now you're Naaman. You expected something big to happen. You expected like this show. You expected the guy to come out and, pray over you, wave his hand over you, maybe like a Benny Hinn thing, throw his hand on your forehead, the Spirit be gone, or something like that. Who knows what he expected? He maybe expected a Pentecostal worship service. I don't know. Hair grow, something like that. But that's not what he got. He never even got to meet the prophet. And the messenger says, go and wash 7 times in the Jordan. And that's it. Nothing spectacular, nothing amazing, nothing miraculous. Look at verses 11 and 12. Look at Naaman's response. But Naaman was furious. Go and wash in the Jordan? Go and wash in the Jordan? Rivers of Damascus are better than the waters of the Jordan. Naaman was furious and went away and said, behold, I thought, he will surely come out to me and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God, not my God, his God, and wave his hand over the place and cure the leper. Are not Abana and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? We have better rivers than they have here. Could I not wash in them and be clean? So he turned and went away in a rage. It reminds me of a passage in James that says, the wrath of man does not produce the righteousness of God. Wrath of man does not produce the righteousness of God. He's angry. This prophet's done nothing. Here he went willing to pay a ton of money to be healed, and now he thinks he's wasted his time. He's wasted his, even worse than time, his hope. You know what's one of the most aggravating and frustrating things in the world is false hope. You know what I mean? Thinking, especially in sports, like you're getting killed, and you're like, oh, it's over. And then you fight all the way back, and you're like, oh, we can do this, we can win. And then you lose in the end anyway. And you I just wish we would have lost in the first place. It was like torment watching this thing. False hope, false hope. So he's furious. He's ready to go back home. And you know what happens if he goes back home? What likely happens? What do you think happens between Israel and Syria? What do you think might happen? Well, Naaman will possibly eventually die. Is that what you said? Yeah. Politically speaking, what'd you got, Charlene? What were you going to say, Charlene? She didn't? No. She's like, war. War is certainly on the table. Yes, you raised, okay, good. Yes. War. Well, Naaman's servants see what's going on, and they have other ideas. Then his servants came near and spoke to him and said, "My father, had the prophet told you to do some great thing, would you not have done it? How much more then when he says to you, 'Wash and be clean'?" I mean, is this really that hard to do? Isn't it worth a shot? And so Naaman calms down because sometimes the initial reaction is not the right one. Right? Sometimes the initial response is a reaction and it's an emotional reaction and not a logical response. Calms down and he says, "Okay, fine, I'm going to do it." And he dips the first time and nothing happens. And he dips the second time in the water, and the third time, and the fourth time, and the fifth time, and the sixth time, nothing happens. And he comes out, and he's like, "This is it. That's it. This is the last one." And he dips himself the seventh time. Verse 14. "So he went down and dipped himself 7 times in the Jordan, according to the word of the man of God. And his flesh was restored like the flesh of a little child, and he was clean." Naaman is miraculously healed. He has his health back. He has his life back. It's an awesome turn of events for Naaman. And what he recognizes at that moment, what he must recognize, what's impossible to ignore, is that Elisha is a man of God. And that his God is the one true God. And so Naaman immediately goes back to see Elisha and thank him. I mean, he's incredibly, his life's been changed. His life's been restored when he returned to the man of God with all his company and came and stood before him. He said, "Behold now, I know." He finally gets to see the prophet. "Behold now, I know that there is no God in all the earth but in Israel. So please take a gift, take a present from your servant now." He recognizes the Lord as the one true God, which is a big thing for a guy who lives in a polytheistic nation. You know, Syria worships multiple gods. So he's going from worshiping multiple gods, multiple fertility gods. He's abandoning all that and saying, "This is the only God. This is it. All those other gods are a sham." He places his faith in the Lord. Only the Lord could have healed Naaman's leprosy. And so Naaman, a Gentile, becomes a believer, seemingly. Can we think of any other Gentiles that became believers? Other Gentiles? Brittany? Can you speak that? The Ethiopian eunuch? That would have been a New Testament, yeah, but yes, yeah. Can we think of anyone else? Sandy? Rahab, and what did she do for a living? She was a prostitute. Rahab the harlot. We have anyone else? I can think of at least another one or two. We'll go with one more. The Kerethites and the Pelethites. Yeah, you would think that. Let's go with Ruth, the Moabitess, maybe, right? So anyway, Naaman joins the ranks of people who turn away from their local foreign gods and worship the Lord and Him alone. And he's so thankful that he offers a gift, but Elisha rejects that gift. He doesn't want there to be any confusion about the Lord. He said, "As the Lord lives, as God lives, before whom I stand, I will take nothing." And he urged him to take it, but he refused. And now, this healing was a free gift, and he didn't want to take anything. He didn't want to take any money for it. He wanted Naaman to know that this was all God, and there's nothing, there's no payment, there's no transaction here. This is a free gift of God, much like salvation, which is a free gift of God. And Naaman is a new man who wants to worship the Lord. I'll try to move through this pretty quickly here because we're pretty much out of time. Naaman said, if you're not going to take anything, please let your servant at least be given 2 mules' load of earth. Let me take dirt. For your servant will no longer offer burnt offering, nor will he offer sacrifice to other gods, but to the Lord. In other words, I want to build an altar from the dirt that's in this land, that's in this holy place. I want to build dirt for an altar so I can worship the Lord where I'm at, where I live. And he doesn't understand all the, again, we're kind of dealing with a pretty new believer here, a convert here. He doesn't have all the answers. But he thinks through the ramifications of what it means to follow the Lord, and he realizes, man, there's some problems in his life. Verse 18, in this matter may the Lord pardon your servant. I'm going to exclusively worship the Lord, but forgive me when my master goes into the house of Rimmon, which is like another name for Hadad, the Syrian version of Baal. When my master goes into the house of Rimmon to worship there, and he leans on my hand, and I bow myself in the house of Rimmon, when I bow myself in the house of Rimmon, the Lord pardon your servant in this, but forgive me. This is a brand new believer who's trying to work all these things out in his life. He's starting to figure out, oh man, some of these things, these are wrong. He immediately experiences conviction and a conscience. I'm not necessarily saying he has all the right answers right off the bat, but he immediately experiences conviction. And Elisha shows grace. Elisha said to him, go in peace. So he departed from him some distance. And that's where I'm going to stop this week as far as the passage goes. Next time, which is going to be a few weeks from now, we're going to see Gehazi and how Gehazi handles this whole situation. But for now, what I want you to understand is that Naaman is healed by the Lord, and his life is so dramatically changed. His conscience is changed to the point where he starts having conviction about sin, about things that are wrong, like worshiping another god or even being in that God's house. There is a New Testament person who talks about Naaman. Do we know who that New Testament person is who talks about Naaman? Someone says Paul. You might have heard of him. His name is Jesus. All right, Jesus brings up Naaman. As for the leper who, sorry. And there were many lepers in Israel in the time of Elisha the prophet, and none of them was cleansed, but only Naaman the Syrian. About 800 some years later, Jesus brought up Naaman. Jesus has compassion on lepers like Naaman. You might remember that he healed 10 lepers in the New Testament. In our passage, we see just a picture of what new belief looks like. We see God's work. We see a man in Naaman who changed his mind. He offered thanksgiving to the Lord God of Israel. He committed to worshiping the Lord alone. He had a sensitive conscience about sin. And we see all that in the life of new believers. We see the Lord's hand all over the place. We see the servant girls spreading the word about the Lord. We see God bringing healing to the leper. We see Naaman, what seems to be converting to the Lord. And we see Elisha showing grace. And by the way, that's something that doesn't always happen. Elisha, we have this new proselyte, this new convert, and we're going to just show him some grace until he figures some of these things out. And all of this, what I see is that the Lord is the only God, and that he saves, and that he has full authority to heal and to give life, both on this earth and in all of eternity. Let's take our hymnals and turn to 400. 400.